Hey, what's up, guys? This is John, aka Casino Crime here. I'm really excited today because this is the first video that I'm doing as an executive producer, officially over at deucescracked.com. A lot of you guys have probably seen me in the forums. Maybe you've watched a previous video from myself, and whether you know me or whether you don't know me, what I'm excited to do is kind of start a new relationship with you guys today, making some brand new PLO content. And I must say that it's quite an honor to be able to do videos for you guys. It's been my dream for a long time, and as I'll get into more later in this video, I'm going to do a short introduction, but really I got started on Deuces Cracked with poker training and really building my poker fundamentals in the first place. So I'm extremely excited to share a lot of the knowledge that I've learned from the game and make a cool series for you guys. Uh, and, you know, More than anything, what I want you guys to know about me is that I'm extremely user interactive. I know there's a lot of coaches and instructors out there, and I know that your time is valuable. So the last thing that I want is for anyone to feel like, or I should say, what I want more than anything is to create the content that you guys want to learn about. I think that a lot of times instructors sort of get lost in they only talk about what they want to talk about. And more than anything, I want to talk about what you guys want to talk about. And I want, week by week, I'm going to be making a lot of consistent content. When I'm doing weekly content, what I want is for you guys to tell me in the comments what you guys want to hear about, what kind of stuff you like that we talked about, and where you think the weaker points in your game are. So a common question that a lot of my friends make fun of me for when I'm playing is I say, "Who is this reg? Like, who's this guy? I don't even know who this guy is, and he's seems like he's coming after me, or this guy's sitting on a massive stack. Like, who is this reg? I want to know who this player is." So it's important for me to tell you guys about who I am. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, I started just like you. In the beginning, I kind of had a mission where I was going to watch every training video on the internet. I was going to read every PLO book out there, and I was going to take detailed notes on them. And I figured that if I learned everything there was to know about PLO, if I consumed every amount of information that was available on the internet that I could buy, that I would eventually become a pro PLO player, which was my dream at the time. When I first started playing PLO, I was working nights in a hospital. It was a job that I really hated. And the way that I got good and was able to eventually quit my job and play poker professionally was because of Deuces Cracked. It was because of training videos. So I'm a big believer in the power of knowledge, in the power of teaching other people how to play poker. And that's why I'm here today. And, through the years I did play a couple of tournaments, and I even played a lot of No Limit and was fortunate enough to win a bracelet in the 2013 World Series of Poker. And it was in six max, and I feel very honored that happened because I do think there's more skill in six max play, and a lot of the videos that I'm going to be doing instructionals for you will be focused on six max play. And I am biased because I think that PLO is much better than No Limit. And I say that kind of jokingly, but seriously, I think that PLO is it's more complex. I think that it takes a lot of skills to be a good PLO player that No Limit doesn't have, especially in today's games when knowledge is more difficult to come by. I think that it takes a special skill to be a good PLO player, and I always kind of envied the guys who were strong in both games, but guys like I get asked sometimes who my favorite PLO player is, and I really love the Patrick Antonius types, the guys that are good at all of the games, the guys who intimidate other players and who aren't afraid to play a lot of hands, kind of a loose, aggressive style. And that's what I'm going to try to teach you guys. We're going to focus on the fundamentals, but we're also going to focus on applying the fundamentals as well, which I'll get into in a moment. Um, you know, and I think that something that's unique about my skill set is that I've got some proven results, and I've also had a lot of students who have had results too. I've had more than 200 students to date. I've actually written an ebook on how to play PLO, and I've had hundreds of people buy that as well, including some videos on my other site that I kind of started from scratch, inspired by the Deuces Cracked videos. So I've played a lot of poker, I've taught a lot of poker, and I continue to play and teach a lot of poker as well. So I think that that's something that'll benefit you guys. I've also played, as you can see here, about 2 million hands, both online and live. I've played live poker for a number of years in Vegas. I lived in Vegas. I've played in the LA casinos. I've played in the Florida casinos. I've even played in European casinos. So I have a lot of experience playing a lot of different games against a lot of different playing styles. And I think that's something that'll benefit you guys as well. So what's really my goal for you? Like what am I trying to teach, and you know, what kind of where am I trying to take your PLO game? Well, realistically, I'm trying to turn you into a PLO pimp like this guy here. You know, the name of my blog is PLO Pimpin', and what I'm trying to make you is, you know, I want you to achieve your goals in PLO, and of course, make more money at this game. Realistically, though, I think really it's broken down into two big goals that I'm always going to focus on with you guys. The first is to teach you how to become a good poker decision maker. And what does that really mean? Well, a lot of people kind of, when they're formulating their goals for becoming a good poker player, they say, well, I want to win more money. I'm in it for the money. Well, it's not really that easy, or else everyone would play poker. First, you need to become a good poker decision maker, and that means understanding the game from a structural standpoint. It means not tilting. It means evaluating opponents. It means becoming good at hand reading. It means really crunching the numbers and board textures and blockers, and knowing the different EVs in a variety of bet sizes. It comes down to a lot of different factors. And a common question that I get from people is, what should I focus on in playing poker? Like, how do I improve my poker game? And in my opinion, and from my experience, as you can see here, I think that whenever you're working on your poker game, no matter what you're doing, whether you're reviewing hands in Poker Tracker, whether you're talking to a friend about a hand that you played at the casino, every skill in poker really is broken down into either improving your theoretical understanding of poker or your application of that theory. So in other words, poker theory meaning like the profitability of 3-betting with different bet sizes, or the profitability of choosing a different value bet size on the river, or the profitability of different open ranges, or different shoving ranges in a no-limit tournament. Those are good examples of improving your understanding of actual poker theory. But the second is arguably more important, and counterintuitively, I find that more people focus on just crunching the numbers in poker theory. But what I've found that separates the truly successful players and the guys that have consistent success and longevity in poker is that their ability to actually pull the trigger and apply the theory that they learn is much better than other players. I see it all the time, and I've seen it in the forums at Deuces Cracked. There's a lot of players who they're unbelievable at breaking down these hands in the forums. And I've found that a lot of the guys that can, quote unquote, speak poker the best typically actually play really low stakes. And I'm talking like, micros. And I think that that's fascinating. I think that there's an interesting breed of people out there, or players, I should say, that are really fluent in speaking poker. They know the numbers. They know what the correct decision is. But when it comes time to actually click the buttons at the table or put the chips in the middle, they struggle to do it. So that's something that I really want to focus on with you guys, is not only pressing and teaching you guys new poker theory that you haven't heard before, or maybe you have but that you need some refreshing on, but also getting in there and like learning how to sack up, for lack of better words, and play better actually in the moment. And that's something that we'll focus on in the upcoming videos. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and as I mentioned, I do a lot of lessons, and something that I always like to start off with is either a quote or a book recommendation with my students. And I find it's one of my favorite podcasts is Tim Ferriss's podcast. He's got kind of a business podcast, and he always starts off with a quote. But what I'm going to start off with today is a book recommendation, and I often get questions from people wondering what kind of poker books I recommend them. And it's ironic because I find that what they need more than anything is to work on that application of poker theory. And what I do is I recommend this book first. And out of, in my entire poker career, there's really two books that have impacted my game more than anything. One is it's called Advanced PLO by Tom Chambers. It's a $2,500 PLO ebook. It's like the most high-priced one out there, but it's incredible. Teaches you a ton about PLO, but it's not necessarily until you're at a certain level. But the other one besides that is this one. It's called With Winning in Mind. It's written by Lanny Bassam. I don't know if that's how you say his last name, but he was an Olympic gold medalist in rifling or shooting, and it teaches you more than it's the handbook for mental training, visualization, writing out affirmations, keeping a performance journal. I can't stress enough how awesome this book is. It's about $10 on Amazon, and you really it's the best $10 you'll ever spend for your game. So, without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on something called the core PLO concepts, and we're going to hop into it right now. So, before I ever do a lesson with someone that's looking to get some coaching, I generally send them three things. First, I send them about a 50-page document that has all of the notes I've taken on every PLO video I've seen on the internet across all of the training sites. Next, I send them a bunch of equity simulations that I've ran on Pro Poker Tools that basically puts all of the common equity matchups in one place, so they can become familiar with stack-off ranges a lot quicker than just waiting to check them out in Hold'em Manager after they've lost a stack. Last, I send them a copy of a section out of Tom Chambers' book, Advanced PLO Theory, called the Core PLO Concepts. Now, everything in Tom's book is really juicy, but from the standpoint of a beginner or transitioning player, I haven't seen anything else out there that even comes close to condensing all of the major concepts into one place as well as he does. And actually, Tom even says in his book that if someone told him that he had a half hour to learn PLO, this is exactly what he would give them. Plus, I've made it required reading for my students, so why should it be any different for you, right? Alright, so the first core PLO concept that we're going to talk about has to do with the power hands. Now, in Hold'em, one of the main reasons why pocket aces is such a strong hand before the flop is because many times a pair of aces will be good if you get to showdown, right? Well, in PLO, this just isn't the case. And most of the time, if you find yourself scooping a big pot at showdown with a lonely pair of aces, then you should consider yourself lucky. And for what it's worth, I'll try to avoid mentioning no limit stuff as much as possible. Because, after all, this is a PLO video, but I'm sure there's enough people watching this that have a solid grasp on no limit topics. So I think it's useful in many cases to point out the similarities and differences between the two. Anyways, if you've read some books or watched any videos on PLO, then you've definitely heard the authors and coaches tell you that PLO is all about drawing to the nuts, which is definitely true. And going back to what I just said a moment ago, aces have the most equity pre-flop in PLO, but it isn't just because a pair of aces is more likely to be the best hand on the river. It's because hands with aces in them draw to the biggest sets, boats, straights, and flushes. Now, in any form of big bet poker, winning your opponent's stack is obviously the primary objective. And in PLO, something you need to understand is that many of the pots that you're going to play are multi-weight, single-raised pots. And the way to win stacks in these types of scenarios is to dominate your opponent's stack-off ranges, which you can do by playing the power hands. For example, if you take a look at a successful player's database, something you'll notice is that the hands that generate the most profit are aces, kings, and big Broadway type hands. There's many reasons for this, but simply put, it's hard to win big pots with 6 high straights or 10 high flushes. Put more simply, the power hands are without a doubt the big money makers in PLO. We'll talk a lot more about creating profitable post-flop scenarios some other time, but for now just realize that a big piece of our profit will come from playing the power hands correctly and dominating our opponent's post-flop. Alright, the second concept we're going to go over basically says that it isn't true that someone always has the nuts, but the nuts is always relevant. Now, a common approach that I've seen a lot of beginners take, myself included, is to only play the nutty monster hands pre-flop, and then pump as much money into the pot when they flop a strong made hand or a draw. Because after all, they've heard that the people that play this silly 4-card game are so bad, right? So in their minds, all you have to do is just knit it up, put in like a million hands, and then get paid and move to the Bahamas after a year or two, right? Well, in full ring PLO, where most of the pots are multi-way and stacks are traded in many nuts to second nuts situations, a nitty approach is probably correct. Even at the micros, where most of the players are very loose and stack off too light, you can definitely turn a profit by simply playing stronger hands than your opponents, while avoiding making too many big mistakes that will cost you a stack. Winning stacks at the micros is easier because the majority of players either can't hand read well enough to pick up on the fact that you haven't played a hand in 10 orbits, or the amount of money they're playing for isn't enough to make them fold whatever hand they have anyway. But once you move up to the more aggressive mid and high stakes 6-max games, nut peddlers get run over pretty easily. Now, as I've hinted to already, the nuts play a key role in defining players' ranges in PLO. And a few questions that are good to get in the habit of asking yourself anytime you're looking at a given board texture are, what is the nuts? How likely is the nuts? And what's our equity against the nuts? For example, let's use a heavy action board like Jack 10-9 two-tone to help illustrate our point. This is a heavy action board in no limit as well, and even though King Queen is definitely in most opponents' ranges, there's a variety of other made hands and semi-bluffs that are willing to get stacks in on the flop that aren't the nuts. But in PLO, if someone takes an aggressive line on this board in the form of raising the flop or betting pot when the turn bricks, the most common question that gets brought up is, how likely does he have King Queen? And going along with what I just said, especially in single-raised multi-way pots, the nuts are a big piece of the range that's willing to get stacks in. So when you're in a hand, it's important to consider what your equity is against the nuts. Because in PLO, there's many more hands that have, 35 to 50% equity against the nuts on a variety of wet boards. For example, the bare nut straight on Jack 10-9 two-tone is a big underdog to a few hands, like Ace King Queen, King Queen Jack 10, and King Queen with diamonds. But also a set with a flush draw is a 65-35 favorite. 3 pair with a flush draw is a 61-39 favorite, and 2 pair with a flush draw is a 57-43 favorite. Alright, now core PLO concept number 3 is the one that you've probably heard the most about, which is that hand values in PLO run close together. And given that hand values run so close together, this means that we probably should just play every hand because you can't miss them all, right, Sammy? Now, whether or not this is actually a quote from Sammy is debatable because I pulled it off a random website. But regardless, I wanted to post a picture of my favorite Lebanese PLO degen to help you remember that even though playing every hand might work well for Mr. Farha here, it definitely doesn't mean that you can pull it off too. Many beginning players justify playing very loose preflop because the equities run closer in PLO. But as we'll talk about in a second, that doesn't give you a license to go nuts. We'll talk more about preflop stats and using a HUD in lesson 9, but for now just realize that our approach in PLO is different than in other games because of how the equities interact with each other. So we know that in comparison to No Limit, the equities run much closer together in PLO. But just how much closer are they? Well, for example, if you take one of the most premium starting hands, Ace Jack 10 double suited, and match it up against any other random hand, it only has 71% equity preflop. Now, this might not seem like a big difference than in No Limit, where aces are about an 85% favorite against a random hand. But something that's important to point out is that the quick fact is comparing the equity of Ace Jack 10 double suited against all hands. Nearly every preflop matchup between good hands is actually much closer to the 55-45 range or similar, which obviously makes a huge difference in the long run. So by now you might be thinking, okay, it's good to know I guess, but why does that matter? Or how can I use this info to make me money? See, even though starting hands in PLO are all technically close if you run them heads up against each other, there's a big difference between the types of hands that scoop big pots and the ones that get you into trouble in multi-way pots. We're going to cover this throughout the lesson, but the gist of it is that since you'll rarely get all-in preflop with 100 big blind stacks, the playability of a hand matters a lot more than what the preflop equity is, especially as the stacks get deeper, which means that the bets on later streets are much bigger than the bets preflop are. Or simply put, preflop is just the foreplay that leads to where the real action happens. Now, I personally think that the fourth concept is the most important out of the 6, so I'm going to spend some extra time talking about it to make sure you really understand why it's important and how it influences the decisions you make preflop. The fourth concept basically says that the most important fact about a starting hand is the distribution of equities that it flops. And I touched on this on the last slide, but I'm going to say it again because it's extremely important, and we're going to be returning to it a lot throughout the entire lesson. Which is raw preflop equity has very little to do with how to play a hand, which is somewhat different than in No Limit, right? Not to say that equity distribution is meaningless in No Limit, but the big difference is that if you dominate someone preflop in No Limit, it's pretty likely that you'll still have a big edge on them postflop as well. For example, if someone has a higher pair or a better kicker than you preflop, you're generally going to be in very bad shape postflop, unless you get lucky and suck out. Now, I want to be clear and mention that dominating your opponents and getting the money in good plays a key role in PLO too. Even though the equities are generally closer both preflop and postflop, that doesn't mean that it's a huge coin flipping variance fest every time stacks go into the middle. You can still get your money in very good, but the majority of your profit won't come from being on the good end of a 55-45 preflop. It's more about identifying the ideal postflop situations for each starting hand, and then putting yourself in a good situation to play profitably postflop, which we'll talk more about later. All right, so we just established two very important things. First, hand equities run closer together in PLO than in other games. And second, the most important fact about a starting hand is the distribution of equities that it flops. I also mentioned that most hands have ideal situations for them based on their distribution of equities post-flop, right? Well, there's several factors that go into making an ideal post-flop situation that we'll go into detail about later. But before we get into more advanced topics, there's two crucial topics to go over before we go any further. All right, there's mainly two different ways to describe how the equity in a hand is distributed post-flop. The first is when a hand's equity is polarized, which basically means that when it flops well, it flops very well, but only on a small percentage of flops. For example, King, 7 deuce rainbow flops the very strong set or better 12% of the time. Trip 7s, trip 2s, or bottom 2 pair occasionally, and then the rest of the time it flops a mediocre and, most importantly, unlikely to improve overpair. If you're looking for an easy way to identify whether or not a hand is polarized, just remember that generally there are hands that do one thing really well. And in fact, I think PLO author Jeff Huang even calls them one-way hands in his book Pot Limit Omaha Poker. I'll talk more about this later, but for now just realize that the three qualities we'll be using to define the characteristics for any given hand are its suitedness, connectedness, and high card value. So when I say that the good examples of hands with a lot of polarity are the ones that do one thing really well, I'm speaking in terms of connectedness, suitedness, and high card value. For example, the abilities of King, 7 deuce rainbow are mainly limited to flopping sets. Queen Jack 10-9 rainbow is a polar hand because its primary quality is its connectedness. And then a hand like Ace 9 6-4 suited to the ace is classified as a polar hand because it does one thing really well, being suited to the ace. Now, if there's anything you can take away from this slide, it's that the ideal situation for polar hands are deep stacked multi-way pots. Remember for a second that a few slides ago, I mentioned that players' stack-off ranges in single-raised multi-way pots are mainly centered around nuts to second nut situations? Well, polarized hands do well in situations like this because on their top 15% of flops, they'll be flopping a ton of equity. Plus, you get a chance to cooler someone by going set over set, or nut flush to second nut flush. In the next couple of slides, I'll show you some graphs that'll help you understand this. But a similar analogy can be made in no limit using a low pair like pocket fives. In no limit, pocket pairs like multi-way pots because they don't flop sets very often, but when they do, they have a ton of equity on almost any board. Okay, so the second way to describe a hand's equity distribution is called smooth equity distribution. Now, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that hands with a smooth equity distribution play much differently than hands that are polarized. In the last slide, I said that hands that do one thing really well in terms of suitedness, connectedness, and high card value are generally polarized. But now we need to figure out what makes a smooth hand smooth, right? I bet if I give you a second, you could figure it out. All right, time's up. I'll just tell you the answer. Hands that are typically smooth have a good suitedness and connectedness, which means that there's more opportunities to flop pairs, straight draws, flush draws, and a variety of other combo draws. For example, a very smooth hand like Jack 10-9-8 double suited does very well in any post-flop scenario because there's so many flops that it can pick up equity on. In fact, any unpaired hand flops a pair 40% of the time, and any double suited hand flops a flush draw 23.5% of the time. And in particular, smooth hands do really well in 3-bet and heads-up pots. Now, I don't want to expand on this point too much because I want to save it for the next two slides. But, later on we're going to go into more detail about how our hand selection changes as the stack to pot ratio decreases. But for now I just want you to remember that smooth hands generally do better in 3-bet and heads-up pots. Does that make sense? All right, good. All right, so to give you a better idea of how equity distribution works and why we even care about it in the first place, I'm going to show you two different graphs. And before I go any further, I'd like to mention that I got these graphs from ProPokerTools.com. which if you haven't been to already, you definitely need to check out and get familiar with how to use their tools, because it's the only website I know of where you can really figure out what the equity is against a variety of ranges. Because unfortunately there isn't really a program like PokerStove for PLO yet. Another program that I really want to mention is Poker Juice. You guys should definitely check out that one. A lot of mid stakes and high stakes players that I've coached have Poker Juice, and I really endorse that product, and I think it's the new Pro Poker Tools. But I happen to get this graph off of Pro Poker Tools. Now, this graph is pretty easy to read, and basically what it does is it tells you the minimum amount of equity that a certain hand has for a given percentage of flops. So for example, if we go to 15 on the x-axis and then follow it up to the curve in the line where y equals 30, you can see that King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow has 30% equity or better on 15% of flops. Easy enough, right? Now, if you remember from a couple of slides ago, I said that King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow is a good representation of a very polarized hand because it either flops a lot of equity or barely any equity at all, right? Well, if you look at the graph here, you can see that against all combinations of aces, King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow flops over 70% equity on 10% of its flops. These are all the flops where kings flop quads or top set, but as you can see, there's a significant drop after the top 10% of flops. Let's check out the next slide to see how the graph of a hand with polarized equity distribution compares to a hand with smoother equity distribution. All right, now I'll be the first to admit that math definitely isn't one of my strong points, and actually, if I remember correctly, I bombed calculus pretty bad in high school. But I don't think you need a PhD to understand that this graph looks dramatically different than the previous one we looked at. The first thing to notice is that the line across the graph is nearly a straight diagonal line, which is much different than the steep line change we saw in the King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow example. Simply put, the transition from the top 10% of flops to the top 30% of flops for Jack 10 9 8 double suited is much smoother than what you see from hands that are polarized. To give you even more of a perspective on the differences between these two hands, if you compare the top 50% of flops, you'll see that King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow only has a minimum amount of equity on about 10%, whereas Jack 10 9 8 double suited averages over 40% on half of its flops. All right, so by now you're probably saying to yourself, okay, these graphs are cool. Polarized hands mean all or nothing post-flop, and smooth hands consistently flop equity more often. But I still don't understand how this is going to make me money and how this fits into the big picture of things. All right, fair enough. See, something you need to understand is that it's not like each hand is either completely polarized or smooth. Far from it, actually. I just happen to give you the extreme examples of each one so that you have a clear understanding of what I'm talking about when I refer to a hand as being polarized or smooth. Here's an easier way to think about it. Imagine for a second that all hands lie on a spectrum of polarity, with the very polar hands, like King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow on the far left, and the smoother hands like Jack 10 9 8 double suited on the far right of the spectrum. Now, each PLO hand has varying degrees of polarity. So for example, a hand like 9 9 8 7 single suited isn't nearly as polarized as King, King, 7 Deuce Rainbow, but it's not as smooth as Jack 10 9 8 double suited either. So therefore, it falls somewhere closer to the middle of the spectrum in terms of its equity distribution. Now, to get a better idea of how this stuff works, I suggest visiting ProPokerTools.com and plugging in a variety of hands to get a feel for how the characteristics of each hand determine how often it flops a piece of equity. We'll be returning to equity distributions a lot for in other lessons, but for now I just want you to realize that all of your pre-flop decisions need to be based on the post-flop scenario it creates, and that most starting hands have a particular set of post-flop scenarios that are ideal for them based off their equity distribution post-flop. Does that make sense? All right, let's move on. Okay, the fifth core PLO concept is centered around the presence of cumulative equity, or more simply, redraws, blockers, pairs, weak and backdoor draws. Now, in a game where coin flipping for stacks is the norm, a lot of your profit will come from being on the good end of the 55-45 matchups. But the difference between being 55 or 45% against a range are based on factors that you might miss if you don't look hard enough. Go into detail about this later, but for now just realize that every time you have a minor piece of equity, you're not only adding cards that you win on, but you're also taking outs away from your opponent. For example, when we have a pair with a draw, we gain equity against sets by taking away a redraw out. We gain equity versus other draws with the pair's showdown value. Or when we have a backdoor flush draw with aces, we guarantee a win when we make the flush, prevent our opponent from winning with that flush, and steal some of his two pair or straight outs. To give you a better visual of what this means, let's take a look at the example in the next slide. All right, so to help you understand why cumulative equity is important, let's compare 3-betting 10% of our stack with ace-ace 8-3 rainbow and ace-ace jack 10 double suited. Obviously, ace-ace jack 10 double suited is a much stronger hand than ace-ace 8-3 rainbow. And it probably won't surprise you that the recommendations in these lessons aren't to 3-bet a hand like rainbow aces. But for the sake of examples, let's assume that we actually did decide to 3-bet both hands in this case. Now, the difference between these two hands is a bit more subtle than the obvious fact that ace-ace jack 10 double suited flops big more often. Both hands flop sets with the same frequency, and ace-ace jack 10 double suited is better because of the additional 20% of the time it flops an overpair plus the nut flush draw, and the 5% of the time it flops the nut straight or flush, and so on. All of this is easy enough to see, but the key is to notice the difference between the two hands on a flop like 9-7 deuce rainbow. And all things considered, 9-7 deuce rainbow is a pretty good flop for dry aces, right? Truthfully, if we were able to get in 25% of our stack preflop, we'd be pretty stoked to get the rest of our money in on a flop like this. But with only 10% of stacks in preflop, getting it in with dry aces against a normal opponent is a losing play, because we're crushed by his range. But on the other hand, when we have the jack 10 gut shot and 2 backdoor flush draws, our overall equity is good enough to get it in, which gives us the chance to realize the piece of equity that we're forced to fold when we have dry aces only. To put it simply, dry aces, a gut shot, and the backdoor flush draws are each worth something, but individually, none is strong enough to play for stacks. When we have all three, we get to realize each of those smaller individual pieces of equity. And in case you're wondering, the equity added by a backdoor flush draw in a standard hand versus hand matchup is between 1 and 3%, depending on what the actual player's holdings are. All right, core PLO concepts number 6 tells us that much more often than in no limit, we would prefer our opponent to fold. And before we get into this any further, what I want to do is return to a few basic concepts that you're probably already at least somewhat familiar with if you've played any reasonable amount of poker up to this point. Now, any successful poker player will tell you that you should always have a reason for why you're betting. What are the reasons for betting? After all, it's something that's probably good to know, since you're going to be doing a lot of betting at the tables in the near future, right? The two main reasons for betting that I'm going to focus on now are betting for value and betting as a bluff. Easy enough, right? Well, a common question I've gotten from students and seen on the forums is whether betting for protection is a good enough reason to bet in PLO. Because most no-limit players agree that betting for protection shouldn't be a main reason to bet your hand. But given everything we've learned up to this point, do you think betting for protection is something we should consider when we're faced with a decision of whether to bet or not in PLO? See, in PLO, betting for protection makes sense for a variety of reasons. First, recall from core PLO concept number 3 that hand values run a lot closer together in PLO than they do in other games, which means that oftentimes players have more equity in a given hand than they realize, which means that many times betting for protection causes them to make a mistake by folding away their equity in a hand. And if you're coming from no limit, this is one of the biggest adjustments you'll have to make. There's far more way ahead or way behind situations in no limit than there are in PLO, which is one of the reasons why you can't get away with check calling out of position in no limit, or why you can get away with check calling out of position in no limit, but not in PLO. Plus, betting for protection makes sense because as you start putting in some volume at the tables, it won't take you long to realize that giving free cards in PLO is a cardinal sin. Because not only are you giving someone a free chance to realize their equity on the turn, but there's also many turns that your opponents can pick up equity on and beat you on the river as well. All right, what I'm going to do over the next few slides is take you through a few hand examples from both No Limit and PLO that'll help explain how the differences in equity between the two games change the type of lines that you should be taking. In the first example, after opening preflop, we hold pocket kings in position on the ace-7 deuce rainbow flop. Now, I included this example not only because it's the same one that Tom uses in the core PLO concepts, but also because it's the classic example that illustrates the concept of what Tom calls value checking, or what most people call pot controlling. The idea here is that even if we're likely to have the best hand, it's better to check an early street in order to maximize the money we make from worse hands and minimize the money we lose to better hands. Easy stuff, right? In this example, checking as a default option works well for 4 reasons. First, if we bet we're unlikely to get action from worse hands, or for that matter, make any hands that are better than ours fold. So a bet doesn't make sense as either a value bet or a bluff. Second, if we're ahead, our opponent probably doesn't have very many outs. And in this case, if we're ahead, he can't have more than 5. Third, if you check, it increases the likelihood that you get value from weaker hands on later streets, including hands like Queen Jack that can pair up to a worse hand on the river. Fourth, by checking back, we induce bluffs that we can profitably call on the turn of the river as well. Now, in PLO, there's many situations where the first condition holds, but the other three do not. So let's check out the next slide and I'll show you exactly what I mean. All right, in this example, we're still holding kings with the same action and board texture, but this time we're playing PLO instead of no limit. Going back to what we were just talking about with King King XX on Ace 7 Deuce Rainbow against standard opponents, a c-bet will almost certainly be called by an ace with side cards, and they'll usually fold everything else. At first glance, it seems like this is a great opportunity for pot controlling, like we did in the last hand, right? But this is one of the easiest mistakes for a Hold'em player to make in PLO. So using the same reasoning from the last slide, let's take a look at the 3 reasons why betting is better than checking. First, although we're still ahead when we have the best hand, any opponent with a random 7 or a deuce has anywhere from 30 to 40% equity, and therefore will usually be making a mistake by folding to our c-bet. Opponents with backdoor draws can have decent equity as well, and boards that are a bit wetter than this one include a lot of marginal hands like bottom pair and a gut shot that will fold to a bet but have 35% equity against 35% equity or more against our kings. Second, by checking, we do not increase the chance that we'll get value from weaker hands, or hands that improve to second best. Those hands are still too weak to pay off a bet. Finally, whereas in the Hold'em case, checking induced bluffs that we could profitably call, Finally, whereas in the Hold'em case, checking induced bluffs that we could profitably call, checking in the PLO example induces bluffs we can't call. Also, there are a lot more turn cards that will give an opponent profitable semi-bluffing situations. So our best strategy is to bet if doing so is immediately profitable, and check give up if it's not. Is all this making sense? Okay, good. So by now you might be thinking, all right, this stuff makes sense. Does that mean there's no value checking or pot controlling in PLO at all? Come on, John, fill me in, man. All right. Calm down. There's a couple of spots where value checking is definitely the best option, and they basically fall into 2 categories. The first are cases where our opponent is unlikely to fold, and we have a hand with good equity, but that isn't strong enough to call a raise or get stacks in with. The second case is similar to the Hold'em example from a few slides ago, where we had pocket kings on the Ace 7 Deuce Rainbow flop, but where we have significant playability advantages on later streets. In the next couple of slides, I'll take you through 2 examples where both of these situations come up. So let's check them out. All right, this goes along with the first reason for value checking that we went over last slide, which is where our opponents are unlikely to fold, and we have a hand with good equity that isn't strong enough to call a raise or get stacks in. Here, the action is checked to us on the button in a multi-way pot, and we have the bare nut flush draw on Jack 10-8 two-tone. In this example, taking a stab on a wet board into a field of aggressive players that like to check raise is obviously foolish. The rationale for betting in close spots is that we don't want to give free cards to people with 30% equity or more. Here, our opponents are letting us take the free card with 30-ish% equity. Plus, it's important to consider our implied odds, because if there's significant money behind in the stacks to play with, then it's definitely in our best interest to keep dominated draws in the pot. All right, this example goes along with the second situation, where value checking is a good option that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. Here, it's checked to us on the button where we hold Ace-King 8-6 double suited on an Ace 7-4 rainbow flop. Now, with top pair, top kicker, a gut shot, and 2 backdoor flush draws on a board this dry, it's possible we would be happy to play for stacks in some dynamics. But generally, this hand is good, but not good enough to continue against a raise. The reasoning behind value checking is that there's a ton of turn and river cards where we'll be able to play profitably. And unlike the example from earlier, where we had King-King XX on the Ace 7 Deuce rainbow board, this time we induce bluffs that we can profitably call down, while also setting ourselves up to value bet on the turn and the river. Sometimes betting the flop will still be better, but checking is viable in a way that checking King-King XX isn't. Okay, and that's going to wrap it up for today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about the 6 core PLO concepts. What I'm going for in this series is reinforcing fundamentals, but more than anything, I want to, as I mentioned earlier, discuss the topics that you guys are the most interested in. So please leave me feedback in the comments, or even feel free to shoot me a personal message. Take care, guys. Good luck.